All right, so I guess we're going to get started. My name is Eric Deggans, and I'm TV critic and media analyst for National Public Radio. And I just want to officially welcome all of you to the Library of Congress's National Book Festival. I've been doing this for a while, and it was a little disappointing to not be able to see folks in person last year, so it is so amazing to see you in person again after a little bit of time away. So thank you for joining us. The name of our program is How Racism Happens, and we'll get to that in a minute, but I want to introduce my panelists here. Linda Villarosa, journalism professor at City University of New York, former executive editor of Essence magazine, and author of Under the Skin, The Hidden Toll of Racism on Our Lives and on the Health of Our Nation. And next to her is Robert Samuels, national politics reporter for the Washington Post, self-proclaimed figure skating guru at the Washington Post. We're gonna have to find some time to get into that. and I met Robert when he was an intern at the St. Petersburg Times so long ago. But now he's co-author of this amazing book. His name is George Floyd, One Man's Life and the Struggle for Racial Justice. So first of all, I hope you guys are gonna pick up both of these books. We're gonna talk a lot about what's in them. But this idea, how racism happens, that sounds like a question, like once you've answered that, you've answered racism. So Linda, what is it? What's the answer? How does racism happen?
Well, first, thank you for, I'm so happy to be in conversation with both of you. Thank you for coming out so early. Thank you for everyone who reads, all the librarians and volunteers. This is my first time here because I write really slowly, so thanks for your patience.
It's okay, I read very slowly, so.
Well, I think in healthcare particularly, racism doesn't happen on purpose most of the time. And it happens, and I was thinking about this because of COVID, when things were very hectic, when things were, especially at the beginning of the epidemic, when no one quite knew what was going on. Doctors didn't have, and other healthcare providers didn't have enough protective gear, and everything was really stressful. And I remember interviewing one of my sources who studies race and medicine, who said this is going to be a huge problem because when things get really stressed, the kind of implicit bias that all of us have that is baked into our institutions, our lives, our work in America, that's when it comes up, when you don't understand because you're really stressed out and it's not in the forefront of your mind.
Yeah, and you know, so one statistic that you have in the book really struck me. College-educated black mothers are more likely to die, almost die, or lose babies than white mothers who didn't finish high school. And so there's this idea in your book, so well laid out, that there is a cost to the racism that many of us experience that gives us bad health outcomes that goes beyond socioeconomic status or education or any of those things. And you talk in the book about a moment when when you sort of realized that this was what was going on. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Okay. I think there's this long-standing idea that poor health outcomes in our country are only due to poverty. And certainly poverty makes everything worse, but the statistic you said was really what made me write this book, because I was so surprised by that, because it was so, the idea is so ingrained that it's poor women and birthing people who lose their babies or die or almost die because of pregnancy, and it seems like so weird in America, where we have the most expensive healthcare in the world, that happens. So when I saw that statistic, I heard about it I play soccer. I know, don't ask. Figure skating, soccer.
Oh, we're gonna ask.
And one of my teammates on my soccer team started telling me that, this whole thing there, education doesn't protect black birthing people. And I did not believe her. And I remember she said, a black woman with a master's degree, just like you said, and she turned to me and she said, don't you have a master's degree? You yourself are more likely to die, almost die, or lose your baby than your white counterpart with an 8th grade education. And I found that so shocking that I said, what we know is wrong about the idea that it's only because of poverty. not to downplay the everything terrible that comes with poverty, but to also say that's not the only answer to poor health outcomes in America for Black people.
Right. And so now, Robert, I'm going to turn to you and ask you the question that solves racism. How does racism happen from your standpoint?
Well, in our book, we not just look at the life of George Floyd, but we go back 7 generations to look at his family's life. And we think about all of the institutions that really are supposed to comprise our social safety net, the things that are supposed to boost us in life, and how often they weren't there to help not just the family of George Floyd, but millions of people like George Floyd who are Black in this country. So when I think about how racism happens, first of all, it happens slowly, right? I think a lot of times when we think about these sorts of issues, we tend to think of people in robes on horses coming and doing nefarious things to people of color. But that's not the only way, right? It encompasses people who might not be intentional, but are playing into a history and stereotypes and biases that are baked in. The other thing is racism continues to happen because it accrues, right? One of the things that I think about all the time is when I was speaking with a public health expert about the health impact of race. He said to me, Robert, at some point, everything piles up. The fact that we have not thought about and acknowledged and confronted some of the historical injustices allow them to continue. And at some point, there's a breaking point. So it happens slowly, and it accrues.
And what's interesting to me about both of your books, but particularly your work, Robert, is we know this stuff, right? We say this all the time, that there's a history of racism that disenfranchises families and means that people at the end of that are trapped in poverty. But you went back and you proved it. I mean, you found his great-great-grandfather, Hillary Thomas Stewart was his name?
Yes.
Tell them a little bit about who he was and his tragic story.
So Hillary Thomas Stewart was George Floyd's great-great-grandfather. He is the first person, when we went through all the historical documents and looked at all the microfiche and all of those things, he's the first person that we know was emancipated. He was not born free, he was enslaved. And he was an industrious man. And over the course of his life, he was emancipated at 8 years old. He accrued over 500 acres of land in eastern North Carolina, which, if you're a city boy like me, does not mean a lot. But 500 acres of land would have meant he would have been in the top 2% of landowners, Black landowners in North Carolina. He was very industrious. So his family was on the way to inherit a great history, right? We see this happen all the time in families, particularly in the South. But before he's able to make one single intergenerational transfer, which is how we transfer wealth primarily through this country, all that land is stolen from him. Not in one swift swoop, but through a series of tax schemes, documents he couldn't read, sales that were made, and he could not read because it was illegal for him to learn how to read, right? And so before he can make that transfer, he loses everything and dies a pauper. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means he can't pass on wealth, right? But it means his family is then put into the abusive system of sharecropping, in which they're never allowed to get ahead. And so how does George Floyd enter into the world poor? It's not because he came from a family or a line of people who didn't like to work or who are lazy. They were industrious people. Whenever a deal was made, and we go through so many of these in the book, whenever a deal was made with the people who owned the land, they did it and they completed the tasks in an exceeding fashion, and still they ended up poor. So you think about not just the economic impact of that, but you think about what that does to what a family learns about America and the mobility that they have in this country.
Right. So one of the answers to how racism happens is that it's systemic and it benefits someone, right? Yeah. And so how do we unwind that? How do we even recognize that? I mean, one of the things that strikes me about both of your books is that you are trying to show people that these dynamics that we talk about in an academic sense actually exist. You're proving that they exist. And I wonder, did you ever have any problems convincing people that what you were trying to show actually existed, that this is actually an issue?
I have a lot of problems with that, especially among healthcare providers and physicians. And I tell the story in my book is after I wrote Why America's Black Mothers and Babies Are in a Life or Death Crisis, with the centerpiece being the statistic about how education doesn't protect Black birthing people, I made a presentation at a hospital. I was invited in the Midwest, and it was the OBGYN grand rounds. So I went in all ready to really dig in with what I had learned. And the first question I got asked was, why did the physician let you into the labor and delivery room to observe what I observed there, which was mistreatment? And I thought, wait a minute, I have just laid out this whole tragedy of Black infant and maternal mortality in America, and the doctor, the first thing he said was that. And then the rest of my time there was the physicians sort of sharing myths about Black women that I had already dashed in the story one by one. And the one that was the most galling, one was that, oh, the reason Black maternal and infant mortality is so high is because of genetics. I was like, no, I proved that in the story. Go look, here's the page number. And then the next was Black women lack a kind of kinship. And I was like, Black women, how are you saying that as a group of people? It was very strange. And by the end, I was so stressed, I just thought, I think I have lost probably 7 hours off of my life in this 1 hour in here. I'm going to leave, and they can just read my story. But that was another reason for me to write that book, was to sort of, here's something that disproves these kind of myths that are embedded in the healthcare system itself, and also a way to lift up the stories of people who have bad experiences, and they're told, no, it's you.
Right. Well, I mean, well, number one, the thing that occurs to me is that after you write a book like this, where you say basically that all the racist microaggressions and aggressions that we have to deal with take years off our life and have impacts on our health, when you go through something like that, are you like, oh man, that's
I am.
2 years gone?
I look at my watch. I do. And let's avoid those, because that is, it's been proven. The idea is weathering. The idea that the lived experience of dealing with discrimination, especially for Black people who have been most studied, creates a kind of accelerated aging that does take years off your life, and it may explain some of the health disparities that we have in America.
Yeah, you talked about weathering, and you also talked about high-level coping, or
yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that concept too?
So that's sort of interweaved with weathering, and it's the idea. So if something happens to you, a microaggression or a macroaggression, your body kicks into the fight or flight syndrome, which is totally healthy. That's really good. And it's like, it causes you to run, to leave the space. Your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, your stress hormones rise. The problem is when it happens over and over and over again, because you're coping with these kinds of aggressions. And that's why your system shouldn't be kicking in that way so often. Then you end up with a kind of accelerated aging.
Wow.
And it's been shown there's been really good research, very good data about this, that shows that can, cause poor birth outcomes and an even lower life expectancy.
Man. So Robert, you wrote in a separate article that I saw in the Washington Post that you and your co-author gained a deeper understanding of racism as a result of working on this book.
Yeah.
Now, you may have talked about it a little bit earlier, but can you give us a little more on that? What did you learn about racism as a result of pulling this book together?
Well, I think one thing that I want people to be sure about is that Tolu and I, we didn't go in to looking at the life of George Floyd to prove an actual thesis. We went in because we had a question. And that question was, what can we learn about systemic racism through George Floyd's life? And the first person, if I'm being honest, that I had to convince was myself. That there had to be, that there were these connections, right? Because you speak with super smart people about things like high stress coping, about the impact that the resistance to integration had on school funding, about how police officers are taught, right? And you hear about them in these incredibly academic, sort of high-minded ways. And then you meet people who lived in George Floyd's neighborhood. And you see them moving, and you see them operating without any of these understandings, right? Without any of that background. And you start seeing all of those things tangibly operating and shaping the way they view their lives and what they can do. And this happened across income. You know, one of George Floyd's best friends, he was a pharmacist. He didn't live in the housing projects, but he lived near the housing projects because he lived in a redlined community. It was segregated because the government suggested it should be that way. And those things really began to make clear sort of these tangible impacts of it. The second thing that became so clear to me happened after George Floyd died, and I was spending time with his brother, Philonis Floyd, and the last girlfriend he had, whose name was Courtney Ross, who's a white woman. And it was probably 2 weeks into the trial, which had been just emotionally draining. And I went to church with Philonis, and Philonis had a breakdown in the church, thinking about his brother. And then I was supposed to meet Courtney, who was speaking at a rally. And it was the first time she was speaking in public. She was very hesitant because she didn't want to cause a mistrial. And there were all of these mothers and lovers there who had lost loved ones to the hands of the police. And they lost their loved ones in ways that were similar to George Floyd. And nothing happened because there were no cameras then. They had no agency. There was no social media. So they told these stories, and no one had believed them. And so I'm there, and I'm watching this interaction, and I'm getting kind of uncomfortable because one of the moms, she looks like my mom. And I turned to our photographer at the time, and I said, you know, I think I'm done for the day. I'm not sure I could handle any more of this. And before we could get to the car, there was a text message that started to be shared around, and it said, they've killed another one. And that was a young black boy named Dante Wright, who the police officer mistook her taser for a gun, and she shot and killed him. Right. And all those mothers who are mourning their child, they didn't miss a step. They got in their cars and they moved to the place where that incident happened. And when I saw this happening, it began to make clear to me that racism in this country is not simply the original sin or the human stain, as Roth once said. That it moves as a force. It's pernicious, it's pervasive, and it started to feel that if there was not an actual acknowledgement or confrontation of American history, it would be something that would envelope all of us, not just people of color. Courtney Ross was a white woman. There are people, and I think that really deepened my sense of mission, and it heightened my understanding of how it moves. Because it was not just something you could beat with a Herculean effort if you could cope. It kept on moving.
I wanted to add something about community, because well, thank you for sharing that, about community and sort of the what you were talking about, wealth, how hard it is to accumulate wealth in some of our communities. And I think we've so long been blamed for that, without a clear understanding of redlining and other, sort of barriers. And I remember in 2020, right before the pandemic started, I learned that where my mother was from in Chicago, Inglewood, people lived to age 60. And then 9 miles north, they lived to age 90 in the same city. And my mom and I went back. I said, let's go back to your community and see, because my mom's so proud of growing up on the south side of Chicago. And I remember going back, and my mom had a list of places where we were going to visit. So she said, we're going to go to the church where I got married to your father. We're going to go to the place, my first place your grandfather bought. All these places, so many of them were gone. They were erased. By the end of the trip, I remember thinking, because my mom was her elementary school where she went with Lorraine Hansberry, boarded up. And even the school that I went to until I was 10, Harvard Elementary School, all the houses around them were abandoned. And I remember saying, Mom, what happened here? What happened? Because it looked more like Mississippi, where her, her parents were from. And when we looked into it, it was not only redlined, but it was subject to contract buying, which meant that Black people couldn't buy homes with a mortgage. You had to buy on a contract. So you were subject to losing that. So there was never an accumulation of wealth there, couldn't transfer it. So that brought down the health status. After I wrote about this, then I went back and found out it also had some of the highest levels of COVID in the city.
Yeah.
Wow. And I have to say, reading both of these books, I got so angry. I got pissed. I don't know how you can hear these stories. I mean, when you hear about how George Floyd's great-great-grandfather got cheated out of all that wealth, and then you come all the way to his conversation with Derek Chauvin, and you hear that he was claustrophobic because he had been in jail before, and he was afraid of the police, and that's why he was freaking out, and they paid no attention to it.
Right.
And then we hear about your experiences, being pregnant and taking care of yourself as well as you can, and still having, problems. And I just got so angry, and I couldn't believe that this isn't some sort of major crusade that we're all talking about every day. How did you guys work on these books without drowning in the anger of it all and the injustice of it all?
Well, for me, it wasn't just the great-grandfather, right? One of the hard things, we dealt with people who had seen the most horrible thing they could imagine in real time. And they also had these histories, these really horrifying histories of things that continue to happen. And our book is filled with strivers. It's filled with people who continue to believe that something good could happen in America if they continue to try. And a part of that is angering, right? Because you see that so many of the systems that interacted with George Floyd and the people he loved and the people he lived with would not meet him halfway. But I also thought about the incredible persistence and the beauty that continued to happen. That we have this debate I have with my college roommate, who's a Republican, about whether this book is a sad book. And he saw it as being very sad because he saw racism as this problem that could not be defeated. And he didn't want to have to deal with it. You know, I thanked him for reading the book. But that's not how I saw it, because I don't think that's how the people who I interviewed saw it. One of the last things that we know George Floyd wrote to himself, George Floyd was a writer, was he had COVID, he was still dealing with his drug dependency issue. We go in why it was so hard for him to get treatment in the book. He had lost his job as a security guard because everything was shut down. Also, almost 1 in 2 Black Americans in Minnesota lost their jobs during the beginning days of COVID. And he's talking about these problems. And at the end of the work, he says, "Man, life really sucks, but life never sucks." And I think about that all the time, right? That even when he was in a dark moment, not knowing that he would die the way he was going to die, he believed that he was going to come out of it. And so there was a lot of pride and persistence. So I just felt like I couldn't get angry. Like there was a great story that needed to be shared with the world.
I agree with you. And one of my favorite parts of my book is finding the Relf sisters. So the Relf sisters were at 12 and 14 in Montgomery, Alabama in 1973, sterilized against their parents' will and without their parents' consent. And they became a cause, and they went to court for this. They won the court case, which uncovered the idea that 100,000 other women in the South had also been sterilized, mostly Black women, and it changed the law. So you had to have informed consent for sterilization. But then the Relf family never got any money for it. So they kind of, no one knew where they were. So I found them in Montgomery. I interviewed them, put them in the book. The story also got excerpted in the New York Times Magazine as a cover story. They still live in public housing together. They're in their 60s, obviously never had children. They had dolls around their house to remind them of to have children dolls. Beautiful, 2 wonderful women. After the story ran, I got this strange email from a woman in Seattle, and she said, "Please call me." So she's a white woman whose husband is a tech, entrepreneur. So she said, "I'm a white person. I've accumulated wealth throughout my life. I want to help, the Relf sisters." And I said, "Oh." She said, "I want to give them a lot of money." And so then all I did was ask, "Are you just giving a lot of that money to one of them, or are you going to give each of them that amount of money?" So she gave each of them that amount of money. So I went down to do a reading in Montgomery, and the woman was on the phone and told them about the money she was giving them. They broke down. They were so happy. They couldn't believe it. And the end of the story is the next day they called me and they said, "Linda, where's our money? We want a new couch." I just thought that made it, the government never apologized to them. They never got any kind of reparations for that, but some kind person gave them some money, which really turned their life around.
Yeah. Well, can I jump in for a little? Because I think this is really interesting. One of the things, I teach a class at Wake Forest University, and one of the principles, the code principles of journalism that I think about is especially when you're dealing with marginalized people, avoid lurid curiosity, right? And I think one of the things that sometimes gets lost is that we don't tell stories for the simple idea that this is interesting and it makes our lives harder or more entertaining and gives us stuff to talk about at the bar. We do it because we believe that when people read, and they read truth told in a full and human and honest way, right, things can start to move. And there are so many instances that you go and you traffic into some of these stories because you still believe that that can happen. And I think that's an important thing to say and to keep in mind about, especially when we talk about topics that are so heavy.
Definitely. So I want to let you guys know that we're going to take questions at the end of this Q&A with me. So be thinking about what you might want to ask, and at a certain point I'm going to stop and get you guys to line up at these microphones, and we'll take as many questions as we can before the session ends. So be thinking about your questions now, and we'll get you to line up in just a little bit. So what's striking me about this moment, and I think about this particularly in relation to George Floyd, is that we have these moments that kind of puncture our complacency. And then all of a sudden people are ready to react. They're ready to do something about these issues that you guys have outlined so well in your books. And then it recedes. And then the system figures out a way to equivocate or explain or minimize. And it feels like we're in the middle of that now. Like we had all this flurry of reckoning in the wake of George's death. And now people are tired of hearing about racism. They're tired of hearing about we need to do something. And I wonder if you feel that, and if you feel that, how do we fight that?
Absolutely. I feel it acutely. One of the things, I think one of the big questions that people have is, why do I need to read about George Floyd? I know he's murdered, he's done, it was bad. What Derek Chauvin did was horrible. I get that, right? And one of the things that we try to remind folks is that George Floyd's story, what he went through, how he went through, was important before he had ever met Derek Chauvin, right? And that's because there are millions of bright boys, black boys, brimming with potential, who are living lives like George Floyd. And if we don't understand some of the institutions that await them and how biases can hinder their hopes and dreams, then we're not creating the America we want to create. The other thing to remember is that Derek Chauvin was not born of an evil ilk. He too, right, had been influenced by a lack of history, a lack of understanding, a lack of empathy that was not delivered to him when he was training to be a police officer. There are untold amounts of police officers who are like Derek Chauvin. There are untold amounts of white people who are like Derek Chauvin. The infection that racism can bring upon a system hurts them too. It is also true, right, that after the summer of 2020, the support for Black Lives Matter went back to the levels that it was before 2020. There was a study from Pew this week that came out that said more than 60% of Black Americans do not believe their lives have changed significantly since, right? So I think what that shows is an importance of telling the stories, but also telling them honestly and with nuance and history. We did not set out to right systemic racism, right? But I think one of the important things is to think of it also as a work of history and talking about the fullness of it. And I think when you sort of expand the conversation, you can still continue to make headway.
Linda, what do you think?
I like when institutions are forced to grapple with it. And I'm really impressed with the Department of Health in New York City, where our former health commissioner was a black woman who mandated anti-racism training for all 7,000 members, employees. And they had to grapple with it. And I asked her, how did that go? And I was thinking she would be self-congratulatory. She was like, it was really difficult. Some people didn't want to do it. But I put my foot down and I said, we have to do this so we're better. Because it's important The state of California now, it started with all people who, healthcare providers who work with birthing people have to go through some kind of anti-racism, anti-bias training. At this point, because of the racial reckoning, now continuing medical education for all healthcare providers must include anti-racism training, and it's mandated by law. So I think that it's important that it sometimes comes from the top down, and sometimes, like we're saying, comes from, you know, a groundswell of people insisting on this.
You know, what struck me about your book, you know, there's a moment where you talk about being aware of the ways in which Black mothers, the risks that they take when they're pregnant. So when you got pregnant, you were going to be healthy, you were going to take vitamins, you were going to work out, you were going to do everything right. And you still had a low-weight baby. And so that made me think, man, if the author of Under the Skin can't escape this, like, how do we unwind this? How does an individual person of color unwind the toll that racism takes on their health?
I think what really struck me was the reviewer in the New York Times book review also had a near tragic birth, and she wrote about it in the middle of the review of my book. And she said, I had read your story and I was trying to do everything right. So I think the one thing is telling these stories and also proving that it's not our fault is important, to just make it feel like we're not blaming ourselves anymore. And this is not an individual problem. It's a problem that we have to grapple with as a society and as a healthcare system. But as individuals, you know, we have to take care of ourselves and each other. I had people around me, thank God, because I had to have my pregnancy induced because my baby wasn't thriving inside. And I was happy that I had a doctor I could talk to. My mother flew in from Denver and was with me. My baby was so small, she fit in the palm of my hand. Now she's, you know, taller than me, and really healthy and smart. But I always thought, what happened here? Is this because of toxic stress? What happened to me? And I'm only a laboratory of one, but at some point, you hear so many stories like this, they begin to add up. And I'm happy that there is legislation about this. It hasn't passed yet, but there is legislation to say we've got to really attack this. And I see individual states, individual hospital systems, and things like that trying to deal with this problem and figure out what's going on.
All right, I'm going to ask folks from the audience to start to line up at these microphones if you have questions, because we want to hear from you as well. And then I'm going to ask a couple more questions, and then we'll get you guys involved. So why don't you start lining up? This is what strikes me about your book, Robert, and what was so affecting to me was that you found all of these sort of historical things that we sort of know about from history books, from the redemption to the failure of the war on drugs, to the problems with oxycodone addiction, to what happened in COVID and the disproportionate effects on people of color. And you connected all of it to George Floyd's life, which I thought was kind of amazing. Can you talk a little bit about just the process of creating this book, and when did you sort of realize that all these major historical events tied into his life?
Right. I mean, as a journalist, it was astounding to think about, right? And we started first talking to different sorts of people who are smarter than us, who are well-versed historians, experts, just about things to look out for. The first thing I did was I talked to someone about the history of hospital systems in the three places where we had known George Floyd lived his life. We spoke with experts on education who are looking at these sorts of issues. And then we started talking to people who had known George Floyd or had grown up in the communities that he had grown up in, or had gone to rehab with him. And I was stunned at so many points that they'd say these things and there'd be this direct connection between what I had been speaking about with a public health expert or with a genealogist. Now, I think it's also important to note that George Floyd was not the Forrest Gump of systemic racism, right? It's not that he just happened to be in the right place at the right time, right? I think going through a lot of this story is that if you looked at people, George Floyd was 46 years old when he was killed. People of that time who were born a little bit after the Civil Rights Movement, after end of the Civil Rights Movement, you'd start to see them dealing with a bunch of those things, and even more so, right? I remember talking with, we were trying to figure out, I wanted to make sure that there are things within the text that were not just relevant to people who are completely ignorant about how racism operates, right? I wanted to make sure that people were learning about everything. I remember having this conversation with my mother about weathering. And my mother's from the island, and from the island of Jamaica, and she worked as a hairdresser. She was trying to figure out how to make it in America. She ended up with sarcoidosis. And I was sort of describing what I learned, and she goes, I think that happened to me, right? And it's just one of those moments. And then there were times where you were looking at like, well, what George Floyd was feeling was something that I was feeling too, particularly when you think about the pain and the hardship of living with the fact that one day might be your last. You might meet the wrong police officer, you might see someone who doesn't understand you, and that could be it. And being able to tell that kind of story was really illuminating for all of us. So we started on the outside, we kept moving in, and then when we moved in, we went back out, and we spoke with the mayor and the governor and President Joe Biden about what they're going to do. So that's how we did it.
That's amazing. And you know, the thing that struck me too was like, if you can produce a book like this about George Floyd, you know, what would the book about Philando Castile say? Or, you know, what would the book about Tamir Rice say? You know, I almost want to know the histories of all these people, because I'm sure, you know, you could tell a similar story about them as well.
Right. That's the challenge, right? I think the big takeaway here is that if we started to examine folks in their fullness, and this is a challenge, one for daily journalism, right? Before they die, you might have a better understanding of why people live the lives they did after they die, right? I think, you know, when I was a cops reporter, you're told just look at a police record and write up what they say, right? Yep. If you looked at George Floyd's police record, you'd have a very different understanding of who he was. And when we went out and we dove in, including speaking to some of the people who are the victims of crimes that had been alleged that George Floyd did, they told an entirely different story. So it's just this reminder to think deeper and to try to see people in their full humanity.
All right. Well, let's go to the person from the audience who wants to ask a question. If you could just tell us quickly who you are and give us your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Nicole Porter. I actually work at the Sentencing Project, which is a research and advocacy group based here in DC. And when I think of George Floyd, I'm from Houston, number one. And also I think of him as someone who grew up during the mass incarceration generation. So, you know, in your comments, Robert, you talk about, you know, why it's an important story to tell to inform a history of structural racism or to understand structural racism. But I'm wondering what the book also shows or demonstrates to other George Floyds, the millions of people who were caught up and have been caught up and are still living with the harms of mass incarceration today.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I think is an affirmation about what actually happened to them. George Floyd spent more than a third of his life behind bars. Six of the officers who had arrested or detained George Floyd had been later arrested themselves for corruption. And it also details some of the difficulties that had been had after George Floyd got out of prison. He wasn't eligible for a professional license in Texas, which meant he wasn't eligible for a third of the jobs in Texas. So one of the things that the book attempts to do is it tries to elucidate some of those things to make it clear, not just that it was terrible that all these people were locked up. It goes through why they were, why it was unfair or disparate, and it also goes through the history of those who tried to make it. And some of his friends did succeed, so there's a roadmap for them as well.
So I'm being told that they want us to wrap it up, but I want to take one more question right here.
Hi, my name is Steve Jones. Thank you both for your work. I wanted to get your comments on how we experience both being an individual and being impacted by systems. I think part of the challenge is for me, it was hard to understand and accept how much I am impacted by the systems that influence me, that I'm not the captain of my own ship, that a lot of the ways I think and behave are impacted by the systems and structures around me.
Well, I agree with you, and it's really hard. It's hard to think about that. When I go into the healthcare system, knowing what I know, I have to calm down and say, there is something that could happen to me, and I know a lot. I'm the person who goes into the healthcare system with my loved ones, and they put a pulse oximeter on my mother's finger, and I know that the pulse oximeter measures black skin differently, and because it's calibrated for white skin. So I'm looking at my mother and I'm thinking, she's 91, and I'm thinking, should I just say it? Do I say, could you do that reading twice? Do you know about this? And I did it. And I saw the person frown a little bit, and I just tried to not be super hostile and a complete know-it-all. But it's hard. It's hard when you know that. But I was glad I was there just to put those people a little bit on blast, so that to know, what, someone's watching you right here, and I'm asking a lot of questions. And my mom isn't the best in the healthcare system. She's older, and she trusts, the system more than I do. And so I think that it's smart to go in with their eyes open.
Yeah. And it kind of bums me out that they didn't know that already, that you had to tell them that. Well, at any rate, we are out of time. I wish I could take more questions. I wish we had more time to talk. We didn't quite solve racism here, but I think we found a few good things to work on. Once again, I want to thank my authors, Linda Villarosa and Robert Samuels. His name is George Floyd and Under the Skin. Do you guys know when you're signing? Because I don't think they told me, but take a look at your, at 11:30?
10:30.
At 10:30. Okay, they're signing at 10:30. So stop by, get a copy of these books, get them signed. They are powerful, and they will teach you a lot. Even if you think you know a lot about racism and how it works in America, they will teach you a lot. I'm Eric Deggans, TV critic and media analyst for NPR. Thanks for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the festival.